In 1867 Texas, a judge held court, but what happened behind his walls was a nightmare whispered only by the dead. This truth you were never meant to hear. In 1867 Texas, a darkness festered. Behind the seemingly benevolent walls of a quiet courthouse, 89 men vanished, their records conveniently altered, their fates a secret swallowed by the very system designed to protect them. This truth you were never meant to hear. It began subtly, insidiously, with the arrival of a traveling Methodist preacher in the remote East Texas town of Milfield. Reverend Thomas Whitmore, a man of faith seeking solace in revival, instead stumbled upon a truth so profound, so utterly horrifying, it would haunt him until his dying breath. Over the course of 18 agonizing months, the impossible had occurred. 89 souls simply ceased to exist. Every one of them, last seen walking into Judge Harrison Crawford's courtroom for sentencing, only to disappear into thin air. The official ledgers, those meticulously kept archives of public record, registered their transfer to state penitentiaries, a simple administrative entry. Yet, a chilling inconsistency gnawed at the edges of reality. No prison in Texas, none whatsoever, held any record of their arrival. A bureaucratic void swallowing men whole. Reverend Whitmore, driven by an unsettling intuition, would eventually uncover the true horror festering beneath the courthouse in Crawford's private basement chambers. What he found there was not merely disturbing, it was a testament to systematic torture, starvation, and cold-blooded murder. Evidence so vile, it would force even the most devout soul to question their very faith in humanity. The Church, in its infinite wisdom, chose to bury his report. For over a century it lay dormant, but now newly discovered archives scream the horrifying details of what truly happened in that courthouse basement, echoing Crawford's own handwritten journals. Journals describing a divine mission, a perverse purification of souls through unimaginable suffering. This is the truth, and it demands to be heard. Section 2. To truly grasp the abyssal horror that Judge Crawford meticulously engineered, we must first descend into the very heart of the community that, by its silence or complicity, permitted him to operate in plain sight for nearly 2 years. Milfield, Texas, was a town time seemed to forget, even as it was being hewn from the raw wilderness. Nestled deep within the dense, whispering pine forests of East Texas, some 40 miles southeast of Marshall, it emerged from the crucible of Reconstruction not as a beacon of progress, but as a shadow refuge. This was a place where Confederate veterans, broken and dispossessed, sought to vanish. A remote sanctuary, far from the prying, judgmental eyes of federal authorities, a haven for those desperate to escape their pasts. Milfield's population never swelled beyond 400 souls, a handful of lives isolated by choice and geography. But that very isolation, that deliberate detachment from oversight, made it a perfect fertile ground for another kind of refugee, predators seeking to operate beyond the reach of scrutiny. The settlement itself was a testament to its founder, Colonel James Milfield, a former Confederate cavalry officer. He had established it in 1864, purchasing thousands of acres of timberland with funds he audaciously claimed to have salvaged before the war. The truth, however, clung to the whispers among the townsfolk, never uttered aloud. Milfield had, in all likelihood, looted those funds from a Union supply train during one of his final brutal raids into Louisiana. But in the lawless, morally ambiguous atmosphere of post-war Texas, questions of provenance were not merely impolite, they were dangerous. Milfield was a town built on shadows, ready to accept any truth if it promised sanctuary. And within those shadows, Crawford would find his stage. Milfield itself was a blueprint of calculated simplicity. Laid out in a stark, unyielding grid, its main street cut a direct path east to west, intersected by 3 cross streets that divided the settlement into neat, uncomplicated blocks. The business district was a minimal facade of necessity, a general store, a blacksmith shop, the modest Pine Grove Inn, and Miller's Saloon, the rough-hewn heart where men gathered each evening, drowning the ghosts of war in corn whiskey. Most residents lived in simple wooden houses, humble dwellings with front porches and small vegetable gardens, speaking to ambitions as modest as their means. This was a town built on necessity, on the desperate desire for anonymity. But at the very heart of this unassuming settlement, a monstrous anomaly rose. The courthouse, a fortress forged of red brick and limestone, its Gothic revival architecture a stark, almost obscene contrast to the humble wooden structures that cowered around it. Judge Harrison Crawford had personally commissioned its construction in 1865, a man who, despite the town's meager means, spared no expense. This edifice, 3 stories high with its pointed arches and decorative stonework, defied its frontier setting. It looked not like a seat of justice, but a medieval cathedral, a house of God, or perhaps a monument to a God far darker. This was Crawford's creation, a physical manifestation of his insidious will, imposing itself upon the landscape, dominating the sky. And within its walls a far deeper, more chilling ambition was already taking root. The courthouse, Crawford's dark cathedral, held a feature far more distinctive and far more sinister than its imposing Gothic facade. Its basement, unusually deep, burrowing into the very earth beneath Milfield like a hungry maw. Crawford's public explanation was disarmingly logical. A necessity for storing sensitive legal documents and precious evidence in the humid East Texas climate, protecting them from the elements, preserving the integrity of the law. The basement windows, mere slits barely visible above ground level, were fitted with heavy iron bars, necessary, he claimed, to safeguard these valuable court records from theft. A plausible story, crafted with the precision of a master manipulator. And the townsfolk, blinded by their desperate need for order in a chaotic world, never questioned it. Why would they? Crawford was not merely their judge, the arbiter of law in their isolated refuge. He was their most prominent citizen, their benefactor, a man who had magnanimously donated the land for their Methodist church, who had personally funded the construction of their modest schoolhouse. His public benevolence was a powerful opiate, dulling the senses, blinding them to the grim realities festering beneath his red brick fortress. The very structure designed for justice held a secret chamber, fortified not against the elements, but against human eyes, a dungeon masquerading as a vault. This was Crawford's insidious brilliance, weaving his dark agenda into the fabric of the community's trust, constructing a psychological control system where civic pride became blind acceptance, and the deep, barred windows were seen not as a prison's confines, but as a safeguard for paper. Section 5. Judge Harrison Crawford himself was an edifice of control, an imposing figure who commanded respect not merely through the authority of his bench, but through sheer, unyielding physical presence. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of a military bearing, he moved through Milfield with the confident, almost predatory stride of a man accustomed to absolute command. His steel-grey hair, a stark contrast to the dust-laden frontier, was always meticulously groomed. His black judicial robes, immaculate despite the raw conditions, seemed to shimmer with an unspoken power, and his eyes, piercing, ice-blue orbs that seemed to gaze not merely at a person, but straight through to their very soul, dissecting intentions, uncovering vulnerabilities. When Crawford spoke, his voice carried the cultivated accent of Virginia's gentleman class, a constant, subtle reminder that he hailed from a world far removed from the crude realities of their frontier settlement. He arrived in Milfield shortly after his courthouse began its ominous ascent, armed with impeccable credentials from the prestigious University of Virginia Law School and letters of recommendation from the most prominent Richmond attorneys. His legal knowledge was undeniable, a formidable weapon. He could quote vast passages of Virginia legal code from memory, cite precedents stretching back to English common law, and construct arguments that would awe even the most learned jurists in the state. The townsfolk, isolated and yearning for stability, considered themselves extraordinarily fortunate to possess such a distinguished legal mind in their midst, especially given their remote location and paltry resources. They saw a pillar of order. They failed to see the architect of their impending nightmare. Yet beneath the veneer of Judge Crawford's formidable intellect and impeccable breeding, an unsettling undercurrent pulsed. a quality the townsfolk couldn't quite articulate, a subtle dissonance that nagged at the edges of their frontier simplicity. Conversations with him, even casual exchanges about the weather, felt less like dialogue and more like interrogations, a probing, dissecting gaze that left one feeling exposed. He never married, despite the persistent efforts of local families to introduce him to eligible young women from neighboring towns, a curious anomaly for a man of his standing in a society built on familial bonds. When pressed about his bachelor status, his tight smile would betray nothing but a chilling devotion. "Justice is a jealous mistress," he would intone, his voice a pronouncement, "and she demands complete devotion from those who would serve her properly." This devotion extended beyond the courthouse walls. Crawford kept no servants, maintaining his sprawling, two-story Greek Revival mansion entirely by himself, a stark contradiction to his obvious means. The house itself, with its white columns and wraparound porches, seemed ripped from a Virginia plantation, incongruous in the raw East Texas lumber town. Visitors, rare and fleeting, noted its spotless, almost sterile condition and the vast library that consumed 2 entire rooms. But it wasn't just the sheer volume of books. It was their unsettling focus. Beyond the expected legal texts and theological tomes, there was a disquieting emphasis on works dissecting divine justice, moral philosophy, and most chillingly, what Crawford ominously referred to as the purification of the human soul. This was no ordinary scholar's collection. This was the dark wellspring from which his perverse convictions flowed, a hidden roadmap to the horrors he would unleash. Most peculiar of all, most utterly damning in retrospect, was Judge Crawford's unyielding insistence on handling all prisoner transfers to the state penitentiary personally. He meticulously, almost ritualistically, refused the assistance of local law enforcement, even federal marshals. A profoundly unusual practice for any frontier judge, most of whom eagerly delegated such mundane, often dangerous responsibilities to others. But for Crawford, each transfer was not a chore. It was a sacred duty, a grim sacrament. He claimed the condemned men deserved his personal attention, his singular focus during what he chillingly referred to as their final hours in the community. His justification, delivered with the chilling cadence of absolute conviction, was a perversion of faith and law. "The law is a sacred trust," he would intone to anyone foolish enough to question his methods, his voice dripping with an almost divine authority. "And I will not delegate my responsibilities to others who might lack the proper understanding of divine justice." And then the true horror of his philosophy would reveal itself. "These men have been placed in my care by God and the people of Texas, and I will see that they receive the treatment their souls require." A chilling declaration, promising not mere punishment, but a meticulous, agonizing form of treatment. This was not about justice. This was about purification. A twisted, unholy process conducted in secret, behind closed doors, hidden from the world. And no one, not a soul, was permitted to witness the true nature of the sacred trust he so zealously guarded. The rhythm of Milfield was punctuated by the monthly visits of the circuit preacher, yet Judge Crawford remained an enigma even within the sacred confines of the Methodist congregation. His attendance at services was strikingly irregular, a peculiar deviation for a man of his public standing. He would materialize only for the most significant holy days, Easter, Christmas, a solitary, imposing figure in the front pew, his expression somber, suggesting a mind consumed by deep contemplation of spiritual matters. His rich baritone would join the hymns, his eyes following along the scriptures in his massive leather-bound personal Bible, a tome that seemed to contain more than mere verse. But the moment the benediction concluded, Crawford would politely, firmly recede. He never lingered for the social gatherings that followed services, politely declining invitations to Sunday dinners and church socials. He was a presence observed, never truly engaged. The community, in their simple desire to understand, began to whisper. Some, out of charity, speculated he was haunted by the unspeakable memories of the war, pointing to his undeniable military bearing and the conspicuous absence of any mention of his Confederate service. Others, more shrewdly, surmised he was simply a man consumed by solitude, a scholar who found greater solace in the cold embrace of books than in human fellowship. The most charitable interpretation painted his reclusiveness as a form of monastic discipline, a sacrifice of ordinary pleasures demanded by his singular devotion to justice. But we know better. This was no devotion to justice. This was a man meticulously guarding his inner world, a fortress of twisted ideology, meticulously separating himself from the very humanity he claimed to purify. His detachment was not discipline, it was insulation, a vital component of the psychological control system he had built around himself and around his unspeakable acts. The town's other significant institution, less grand but equally central to Milfield's daily life, was the combination jail and courthouse basement. The jail, visible to the public, was a modest affair, a holding area with 4 cells, capable of accommodating perhaps a dozen men at most. These cells offered basic amenities: wooden bunks, chamber pots, barred windows that allowed for adequate light and ventilation. Prisoners held here were fed regularly, allowed visitors in accordance with standard practices across Texas. This was the public face of justice, a seemingly transparent system for all to witness. But this facade concealed a monstrous truth. The basement, the very foundation upon which the courthouse stood, extended far, far beyond what any visitor could ever see. It stretched not just wide, but deep into the very earth beneath the courthouse, a clandestine labyrinth of chambers that Judge Crawford had not merely approved, but had designed and supervised personally. Every stone, every shadowed corridor, every hidden recess was a deliberate stroke of his architecturally perverse will. This subterranean network, a secret kingdom of his own dark creation, was kept perpetually locked. Multiple heavy-duty padlocks, reinforced iron bars. These were not mere security measures. They were seals, guarding against the intrusion of sunlight, of human witness, of inconvenient truth. His public explanation, smooth as riverstone, claimed it housed sensitive legal documents and evidence requiring protection from the humid East Texas climate and potential thieves. But the true contents, the chilling purpose of these unseen chambers, spoke of a vault designed not for paper, but for flesh, for souls, for the dark harvest of his unholy mission. Section 10. Even within Crawford's meticulously guarded subterranean domain, one soul was granted limited, carefully controlled access: Martha Kellerman, the courthouse cleaning woman. A widow in her 50s, hardened by the brutal realities of a post-war existence, Martha had taken the cleaning job to simply survive after her husband's demise. She was known throughout Milfield for her quiet discretion, her unwavering work ethic, qualities that Crawford, ever the shrewd judge of character, deemed invaluable. He permitted her access only to the upper levels of his basement, the more mundane zones of document storage and evidence rooms. But even these glimpses, carefully supervised by Crawford's piercing gaze, were enough to plant insidious seeds of doubt in Martha's mind, seeds she was terrified to voice. The chambers she was allowed to clean were not mere storage areas. They were far more elaborate than necessary, their stone walls meticulously mortared, their floors surprisingly level and unnervingly well constructed for a humble frontier courthouse basement. It was in these seemingly innocuous details that the first whispers of a deeper, darker truth began to stir. And then there was the air. A strange, unsettling mixture of odors clung to the subterranean chambers. The expected mustiness of underground spaces was there, yes, but it was overlaid with something sharper, something profoundly more unpleasant, a scent Martha could not identify, yet which coiled in her gut with chilling unease. Crawford, sensing her nascent curiosity, had offered a plausible, yet ultimately unsatisfying explanation. The extensive construction was necessary due to the unstable soil, a testament to his engineering prowess. He spoke of Virginia cellars and wine cellars, demonstrating a knowledge that impressed Martha, even as it failed to quell the gnawing hunger of her curiosity. She had seen too little, yet smelled too much. The scent of a secret, festering in the dark. The pattern, the insidious, meticulously orchestrated rhythm that would ultimately claim 89 souls, began to solidify in the bitter winter of 1866. At first, no one noticed, or perhaps no one dared to. The transition was so gradual, so subtly woven into the chaotic fabric of a frontier justice system, that it seemed like nothing more than a natural, if harsh, evolution. Men condemned in Crawford's courtroom for a spectrum of crimes, horse theft, assault, robbery, desertion from the Confederate Army, disturbing the peace, would simply vanish. They would disappear into what everyone assumed was the efficient, brutal machinery of Texas justice, swallowed by the vast, unforgiving landscape beyond Milfield. That winter was a season of profound isolation, even by the unforgiving standards of East Texas. Ice storms tore down telegraph lines, severing the town's fragile connections to the outside world. Travel between communities became a treacherous, almost impossible endeavor for weeks at a time. The inherent isolation that already defined Milfield deepened, curdling into a suffocating shroud. These were the perfect conditions, the precise, divinely orchestrated circumstances for Crawford's activities to flourish, unobserved, unchecked by any outside authority. Federal authorities, already overwhelmed by the titanic challenges of Reconstruction, possessed neither the time nor the resources to scrutinize the operations of a remote courthouse hidden deep within the East Texas wilderness. The stage was set. The perfect, unseen crucible for the monstrous acts that were about to unfold, shielded by the chaos of a broken nation and the silence of the pines. The first soul to be irrevocably swallowed by this grim, emerging pattern, the first documented victim whose disappearance would later pierce the veil of silence, was a man named Thomas Burke. An Irish immigrant, new to this unforgiving land, he arrived in Milfield mere months prior, a man fueled by the desperate hope of building a new life. He sought work in the lumber mills, his ambition simple, to earn enough to bring his wife and children over from County Cork, to reunite his shattered family on this distant shore. But hope in Milfield was a fragile, dangerous commodity. Burke found himself accused of a trivial offense, stealing chickens from a neighbor's farm. A minor infraction by any reasonable standard of frontier justice. Yet in Crawford's court, minor offenses could become death sentences. Burke stood utterly exposed. He had no family in Texas, no powerful friends to whisper in his ear, no advocate to champion his interests beyond Crawford's own perfunctory, almost mocking appointment of counsel. The trial itself was a macabre performance, conducted with Crawford's characteristic chilling attention to legal procedure. Witnesses were called, testimony delivered. Burke granted the hollow opportunity to speak in his own defense. But every step, every word, felt theatrical, a grim pantomime. It was as if Crawford was merely performing the ritual of justice rather than actually pursuing its truth. The outcome, chillingly, seemed predetermined. Thomas Burke was sentenced to 2 years in the state penitentiary, a disproportionate, utterly shocking punishment for what should have been a paltry offense. The stage was set, the trap sprung, and the first of 89 souls was marked for an unspeakable fate. Thomas Burke, the Irish immigrant, was led away in shackles, his fate sealed by Crawford's chilling verdict. And that, chillingly, was the last anyone in Milfield ever truly saw of him. He simply ceased to exist within the public sphere. Crawford, ever the meticulous orchestrator of illusion, explained his methods to the few townsfolk who dared to inquire. He claimed to have arranged Burke's transfer under the cloak of night, preferring to conduct such grim business away from the public eye. "There's no need to make a spectacle of these proceedings," he would calmly state, his voice betraying no hint of the monstrous truth. "The man has a right to maintain some dignity even in his disgrace." A chilling veneer of compassion cloaking an act of absolute depravity. But the facade, meticulously crafted as it was, held a fatal flaw. Martha Kellerman, the quiet courthouse cleaning woman, was the first to sense the insidious shift, the first to note that something was profoundly amiss with these transfers. Each morning she would arrive early, sweeping away the dust, preparing the building for another day of manufactured justice. She expected evidence of Burke's departure, perhaps the muddy footprints of a transfer wagon, or discarded paperwork left on Crawford's desk. Instead, she found nothing, no trace, no sign that anyone had entered or left the building during the night. When she voiced this subtle observation to Crawford, his smile, always polite, never quite reached his eyes. "I take pride," he said, his voice laced with an unnerving smoothness, "in leaving no trace of these unpleasant necessities. The people of Milfield shouldn't have to be reminded of the criminal elements in our midst every time they enter this building." A chilling testament to his psychological control, a declaration of intent to erase not just men, but their very passage. This was not dignity. This was utter oblivion. As the ruthless winter of 1866 tightened its grip, and the list of sentenced prisoners grew longer and eerily shorter, Martha began to notice other peculiarities. Subtle tremors in the meticulously crafted facade of Judge Crawford's operations. What began as a flicker of unease transformed into a deep, pervasive dread that invaded her restless sleep. Crawford was working later and later into the unforgiving nights, his office windows, beacons of sinister industry, glowing with lamplight well past midnight. Martha could see the solitary glow from her small cabin behind the courthouse, and often she found herself lying awake, her mind tormented by the chilling question of what legal business could possibly demand such tireless dedication during the dark, silent hours before dawn. But more disturbing still than the ceaseless lamplight were the sounds. Faint, yet distinct, they occasionally drifted through the courthouse's formidable thick walls during these late-night sessions. Martha, a woman whose life had been spent cleaning the deepest recesses of buildings, knew the difference. She understood the normal settling of timber and stone, the creaks and groans of an aging structure. What she heard emanating from the courthouse basement during Crawford's midnight vigils was not the mundane symphony of an old building. It sounded undeniably like human voices. Muffled conversations, yes, but interspersed with occasional shouts. And then the sounds that curdled her blood, disturbingly, unmistakably, like sobbing or moaning. When Martha, finally, summoning a courage born of pure dread, dared to ask Crawford about these nocturnal disturbances, his explanation was both plausible and utterly unsatisfying. "The acoustics in that basement are quite peculiar," he told her, his characteristic patient smile failing to reach the depths of his piercing blue eyes. "Sound carries in unexpected ways through those stone chambers. What you're hearing is probably the settling of the building, or perhaps rats in the walls. Old buildings make all sorts of mysterious noises, particularly during the winter months." But Martha, born and raised in a farmhouse older than her own memory, knew the difference between the innocent sounds of aging wood and stone and the desperate, fear-laced cries of human beings. Her skin crawled with unnamed dread. The truth, whispering from the dark heart of the courthouse, was no longer just a suspicion. It was a terrifying, undeniable echo. As the ruthless winter of 1866 tightened its grip, and the list of sentenced prisoners grew longer and eerily shorter, Martha began to notice other peculiarities. Subtle tremors in the meticulously crafted facade of Judge Crawford's operations. What began as a flicker of unease transformed into a deep, pervasive dread that invaded her restless sleep. Crawford was working later and later into the unforgiving nights, his office windows, beacons of sinister industry, glowing with lamplight well past midnight. Martha could see the solitary glow from her small cabin behind the courthouse, and often she found herself lying awake, her mind tormented by the chilling question of what legal business could possibly demand such tireless dedication during the dark, silent hours before dawn. But more disturbing still than the ceaseless lamplight were the sounds. Faint, yet distinct, they occasionally drifted through the courthouse's formidable thick walls during these late-night sessions. Martha, a woman whose life had been spent cleaning the deepest recesses of buildings, knew the difference. She understood the normal settling of timber and stone, the creaks and groans of an aging structure. What she heard emanating from the courthouse basement during Crawford's midnight vigils was not the mundane symphony of an old building. It sounded undeniably like human voices. Muffled conversations, yes, but interspersed with occasional shouts. And then the sounds that curdled her blood, disturbingly, unmistakably, like sobbing or moaning. When Martha, finally, summoning a courage born of pure dread, dared to ask Crawford about these nocturnal disturbances, his explanation was both plausible and utterly unsatisfying. "The acoustics in that basement are quite peculiar," he told her, his characteristic patient smile failing to reach the depths of his piercing blue eyes. "Sound carries in unexpected ways through those stone chambers. What you're hearing is probably the settling of the building, or perhaps rats in the walls. Old buildings make all sorts of mysterious noises, particularly during the winter months." But Martha, born and raised in a farmhouse older than her own memory, knew the difference between the innocent sounds of aging wood and stone and the desperate, fear-laced cries of human beings. Her skin crawled with unnamed dread. The truth, whispering from the dark heart of the courthouse, was no longer just a suspicion. It was a terrifying, undeniable echo. The chilling inconsistencies deepened, stretching beyond the silent road and the unheard transports, penetrating the very fabric of Milfield's commerce. Martha began to notice other equally disturbing details, signals that screamed of a truth far more sinister than any simple judicial procedure. Judge Crawford, the austere paragon of justice, was ordering an utterly anomalous amount of supplies for his courthouse, quantities far, far beyond what would be necessary for the handful of prisoners typically held overnight before transfer. His monthly orders from the general store, once routine, now swelled to monstrous proportions. Enormous quantities of hardtack, salt pork, beans, and cornmeal. Amounts that could sustain not merely a dozen men for a night, but dozens of men for extended periods. When the store owner, a man whose life revolved around predictable inventory, voiced his quiet bewilderment to Martha, Crawford, ever the master of plausible deniability, offered a smooth, reassuring explanation. He was merely stockpiling in anticipation of severe weather, preparing for delays in transfers. A pragmatic foresight, perhaps, but even more concerning, even more profoundly unsettling, were the medical supplies. Bandages, laudanum, surgical instruments, ordered with increasing, alarming frequency, an inventory that seemed grotesque for treating the minor injuries that might occur during normal courthouse operations. When Martha, her heart now a hammer in her chest, dared to question this, Crawford's explanation, delivered with that unsettling, patient smile, offered another veneer of public service. He had simply taken on the responsibility of providing medical care for prisoners who arrived at his courthouse in poor, desperate condition, a claim that, in its very benevolence, masked a horrifying reality. These supplies were not for healing, they were for enduring or prolonging agony. They were the chilling testament to a hidden agenda, a clandestine operation of terror festering deep beneath Milfield. Martha Kellerman, the quiet cleaning woman, could no longer dismiss the chilling inconsistencies. The colossal shipments of food, of hardtack and cornmeal, enough to sustain a small army, were not for sporadic delays. The medical supplies, not bandages for minor scrapes, but laudanum and surgical instruments ordered with terrifying frequency, spoke not of care, but of prolonged agony. Crawford's explanations, once smoothly delivered, now dissolved into the thin air of Martha's growing dread. Her senses, sharpened by the silent terror, began to translate every creak of the courthouse, every muffled sound from the depths, into a language of suffering. The whispers in the basement were not rats. They were echoes, the sounds of sobbing, of desperate pleas, the faint, horrifying symphony of human despair. She knew, with a certainty that froze her blood, that the prisoners never left. The phantom wagons, Crawford's elaborate tales of dignity and disgrace, all were lies. The men walked into the courthouse, into that ominous red brick fortress, and simply vanished into its foundations. Martha began to perceive the horrifying truth. Judge Crawford's purification was not a legal process. It was a ritual, and the courthouse not a place of justice, but a charnel house, a living tomb where souls were meticulously broken, then erased. Her discreet nature, her very survival instinct, battled against the desperate urge to scream the truth, for to speak would be to invite the same oblivion that had claimed those 89 souls. She was no longer just cleaning a courthouse, she was haunting a crypt, and her silence now was a heavy cloak of complicity. The weight of her terrifying knowledge became an unbearable burden, pressing down on Martha Kellerman, threatening to crush her very spirit. Every sweeping motion, every dust particle lifted from Crawford's polished floors, felt like an act of complicity in the unspeakable horror festering beneath her feet. Her quiet discretion, once her greatest asset, now felt like a curse. She knew. She heard the faint echoes of torment. But who would believe her? Who could believe such a monstrous truth about their respected judge, their benefactor? The unspoken dread isolated her as profoundly as Crawford's victims were isolated in his hidden depths. Yet, unseen by Martha, a different kind of curiosity was beginning to stir. Reverend Thomas Whitmore, the very preacher whose initial arrival had inadvertently set this dark chain in motion, found himself increasingly troubled. Not by the official records, which seemed neatly in order, but by the gaping silences, the hushed tones when the topic of the vanished men arose. He began to notice the subtle changes in Martha's demeanor, the haunted look in her eyes, the way she seemed to shrink from the courthouse walls. Her fear, unspoken, became a beacon in his own spiritual fog. Driven by a burgeoning unease that defied rational explanation, Reverend Whitmore began to question. He wasn't looking for scandal, he was searching for souls, and in his quiet, persistent inquiries, he started pulling at threads that had been meticulously woven into the fabric of Milfield's silence. He questioned the distant prisons, the dates, the non-existent transfer teams, each query a tiny prick at the skin of institutional complacency, bringing him closer to the abyssal truth, closer to the cursed echoes that only Martha had truly heard. This was the moment the true investigation began, and the price of this knowledge would be paid in blood and sanity. Reverend Whitmore's quiet inquiries soon transformed into a relentless spiritual crusade. The official reassurances, once sufficient, now tasted like ash. He delved deeper, examining courthouse records, questioning the few men who remembered the vanished prisoners. Each answer, each polite deflection, only amplified the sinister resonance of Martha's unspoken fear. His investigation, initially driven by concern for lost souls, quickly became a chilling pursuit of forbidden knowledge. The path led inevitably back to the red brick fortress, to the formidable Judge Crawford, and to the omnipresent shadow of the courthouse basement. Driven by an intuition that burned hotter than any frontier sun, Whitmore sought by any means necessary to gain access to the forbidden depths. He bypassed the official channels, knowing they were compromised. He watched, he waited, he sought out the weaknesses in the judge's impenetrable defenses, and then, in a moment, born of desperation and sheer, terrifying luck, he found them. Not the men themselves, but something far more damning. Hidden within a meticulously concealed compartment in Crawford's private office, far from the public eye, lay a collection of leather-bound journals, Crawford's own handwritten accounts. These weren't legal notes. They were the terrifying chronicle of a mind twisted into depravity. Pages upon pages detailed his monstrous, divine mission, his meticulous purification process through calculated, agonizing suffering, the horrific specifics of starvation, forced labor, and systematic psychological torture. The grim tally, soul by soul, of the 89 men who had entered his court, only to vanish into his unholy crucible. This was not justice. This was a perversion of biblical proportions, an ancient corruption cloaked in judicial robes, revealing a psychological control system so utterly depraved it tore at the very fabric of human dignity. The echoes of those 89 souls, no longer silent, now screamed from the pages of Crawford's own confession. The chilling truths etched into Judge Crawford's journals confirmed Reverend Whitmore's darkest fears. The methodical dehumanization, the agonizing purification, the calculated murder of 89 souls, all meticulously documented by the man who believed he wielded divine justice. The very foundations of what Whitmore understood as faith, as law, as humanity, shattered under the weight of Crawford's monstrous confession. This was not just a case, it was a testament to the purest form of evil, cloaked in judicial robes and consecrated by a perverted ideology. Armed with this damning evidence, Reverend Whitmore returned, not seeking justice from the Milfield courts, but from a higher authority within the Methodist Church. He presented his report, a meticulously detailed account of Crawford's inferno, hoping to expose the horrifying rot that had festered in the Texas wilderness. But institutions, even those built on faith, have their own mechanisms of survival. The Methodist Church, fearing the irreparable damage such a scandal would inflict upon its reputation, upon its very mission in a volatile post-war America, made a chilling, calculated decision. They did not pursue justice. They pursued silence. Whitmore's horrifying report, complete with Crawford's own confessions, was buried, classified, suppressed for over a century, swallowed by the bureaucratic maw of the very organization meant to uphold moral truth. Judge Crawford himself simply vanished from Milfield, his grim harvest complete, his horrifying legacy sealed away from public scrutiny. He was never brought to justice in this life, his fate an unconfirmed whisper. The 89 souls, unheard. This is the truth of Behind Crawford's Walls, the cursed echoes of 89 souls. A chilling reminder that the most terrifying secrets are not found in ancient ruins or forgotten tombs, but in the dark heart of power, protected by the very systems we are taught to trust. You have heard it now, and this forbidden knowledge, this glimpse into the true face of institutional manipulation and ancient corruption will stay with you. It will change you forever.